It was a Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court, a fairly ordinary day by all appearances. My docket was full, as usual, a mix of traffic violations, parking tickets, and a few cases that required a bit more attention. But as I've learned over decades on the bench, you can never predict when an ordinary morning will turn into something extraordinary. Not because of the case itself, but because of how someone chooses to behave in this courtroom. That morning, the bailiff called the next case. Jennifer Hartwell, he announced. A woman in her early 40s walked up to the podium. The moment she entered, the atmosphere shifted. You could feel it. She was dressed impeccably, a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than some people's monthly salary, a designer handbag, and a Rolex that caught the light every time she moved her hand. She looked like she came straight from a boardroom, and she carried herself like she was still in one. There was confidence in her step, but it wasn't the grounded confidence of someone composed. It was the brittle, sharp-edged confidence of entitlement. She glanced around the courtroom like she was inspecting a hotel lobby that didn't quite meet her standards. Then she sighed audibly when she had to wait for me to finish reviewing a file before addressing her. When I finally looked up, I greeted her as I do everyone. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell," I said with a smile. "I see you're here for a speeding violation on Route 95. Please tell me what happened." Her tone was immediately defensive, but not nervous, not apologetic. Cold. "Your Honor," she began, "I was driving to an important business meeting. The speed limit on that stretch is ridiculously low. Everyone goes 65 to 70. I was going with the flow of traffic." Now, I've heard that line hundreds of times before. Now, I was going with the flow, but there was something in her voice that made it clear she didn't think the law applied to her. She wasn't explaining herself. She was criticizing the law itself, as though it were beneath her. I looked down at the citation. "Miss Hartwell," I said evenly, "the officer clocked you at 68 in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. That's 23 miles over the limit. That's not a small difference." She folded her arms, unamused. "With all due respect, Your Honor, that section just changed from 55 to 45. It's a speed trap. Everyone knows it. Designed to generate revenue, not safety." There was a murmur in the courtroom. I could feel the temperature of the room change. She wasn't just arguing her case. She was accusing the city and the police department of corruption. I've heard frustration before, but this was different. This was disdain. "Miss Hartwell," I replied calmly, "whether you agree with the speed limit or not, it's posted clearly. When you're driving 23 miles over the limit, you're putting other drivers at risk." She exhaled loudly, a long, exaggerated sigh that said more than any words could. The kind of sigh that says, "I can't believe I have to waste my time on this." "Your Honor," she said flatly, "I've been driving for 25 years without a single accident. I'm a safer driver at 68 than most people are at 45. "Your Honor, I should note that Miss Hartwell has 3 prior speeding violations in the past 5 years. 2 paid, 1 reduced through traffic school." That got her attention. Her head snapped toward the prosecutor. "Those are irrelevant to this case," she said sharply. I glanced down at her file again. "Actually, Miss Hartwell," I said, "they're quite relevant. They show a pattern of behavior, repeated speeding violations. This isn't a one-time mistake. It suggests a disregard for traffic laws." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't have disregard for anything, Your Honor. I have places to be and outdated speed limits that don't reflect modern vehicle safety standards." At that moment, I could see several people in the gallery exchanging glances, a few shaking their heads. They'd seen enough to understand where this was heading. "Miss Hartwell," I said, keeping my tone level, "I understand you feel the speed limit is too low, but the way to change that isn't to ignore it. It's to petition the city council or the state traffic authority." She smirked, a tight, dismissive smile. "With respect, Your Honor, I don't have time to fight City Hall over every poorly conceived regulation." I couldn't help but respond, "But you have time to come to traffic court repeatedly." That line drew a few quiet chuckles from the gallery, not from mockery, but from recognition of truth. She didn't find it amusing. Her eyes flashed with irritation, as if she couldn't believe anyone would dare point out the irony. I continued reviewing The officer's report. A Miss Hartwell, Officer Patterson noted that when he pulled you over, you were argumentative and refused to provide your license initially. Is that accurate? I asked why I was being pulled over. She snapped. Muted. You absolutely have that right, I said, but according to the report, you told the officer he was wasting your time and that you had better things to do than deal with incompetent traffic enforcement. She didn't deny it. She just said I was late for a meeting. A very important meeting that cost my company money because I was sitting on the side of the highway. I leaned forward slightly. Miss Hartwell, you were late because you were speeding. The officer didn't make you speed. You chose to. Her response was short and cutting. The law is arbitrary. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end the way she expected. Because when someone stands in my courtroom and calls the law arbitrary, they've already decided they're above it. Still, I tried one last time to reach her. The law isn't arbitrary, Miss Hartwell. The speed limit exists for safety. Your belief that you're above it doesn't make it optional. She stared back at me, jaw tight. I never said I was above it. Your actions, I replied, say otherwise. That was the moment before the storm, before her pride would cost her everything. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but what happened next would turn a routine speeding ticket into one of the most unforgettable moments of my career. The courtroom was silent for a few long seconds after I'd reminded Miss Hartwell that her actions spoke louder than her words. The air in the room had grown heavy, not hostile, but charged with something unspoken. Everyone could sense that she was balancing on the edge between pride and humility, but no one could have guessed which direction she was. I turned to move on, intending to announce my ruling. But before I could speak, she did something I hadn't seen in all my years behind the bench. She rolled her eyes dramatically, muttered something under her breath. And then, in full view of everyone in that courtroom, she lifted her right hand and extended her middle finger. The room froze. For a moment, it felt as though the air had been sucked right out of the chamber. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed deafening. People in the gallery gasped, some covering their mouths, others glancing at me to see how I'd react. The bailiff stiffened, his hand instinctively dropping to his side. And there she stood, unmoved, unbothered, her expression calm, almost smug, as though she'd just made a point she was proud of. I didn't speak right away. I've learned over time that silence can speak louder than anger. When you rush to respond, you give emotion control. But when you let silence linger, it allows the weight of the moment to settle on everyone in the room. Finally, I leaned forward. Miss Hartwell, I said slowly, my tone steady. Did you just make that gesture toward me? Her eyes met mine, defiant, unwavering. I did, she said. And before you overreact, I'd like to remind you that freedom of expression is protected under the First Amendment. There it was, arrogance dressed as intellect. I took a slow breath. The freedom of expression, I repeated, is a cornerstone of this nation. You have every right to express your opinions, to voice dissent, to criticize even those in authority. But there's a difference, Miss Hartwell, between freedom of expression and contempt of court. Her smirk faltered slightly. It was just a gesture, she said. It didn't hurt anyone. I looked at her carefully. Hey, you're right, I said quietly. Hey, it didn't cause physical harm. It didn't cause physical harm. But harm isn't always physical. In this courtroom, Miss Hartwell, respect isn't optional. It's the foundation upon which justice stands. When you show contempt for this court, you don't insult me personally, you insult the law itself. For a moment, she looked as though she was going to interrupt, but I held up a hand. Now let me finish, I said gently. You may believe this is a room where fines are paid and tickets are dismissed. But it's much more than that. It's a place where we try to remind people that laws matter, that civility matters. When that breaks down, when respect becomes optional, the very idea of justice collapses. Her confidence was starting to waver now, replaced by an uneasy tension behind her eyes. She tried to recover. Your Honor, I didn't mean to. I stopped her with a quiet firmness. Intentions don't erase actions. The courtroom was still silent, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room but fills a conscience. Even those waiting for their own cases seemed to understand they were witnessing something far beyond a speeding ticket. I turned slightly toward the bailiff. Mr. Ramirez, I said calmly, please step forward. The bailiff nodded and took a slow, measured step toward the defendant's podium. At that moment, the color drained from Miss Hartwell's face. Wait a second, she said quickly, her voice rising. What are you doing? Miss Hartwell, I said, you've just committed contempt of court. A direct and deliberate act of disrespect in a judicial proceeding. That is a criminal offense. Her bravado crumbled. You can't be serious. It was just a reaction. You can't throw me in jail for that. I looked at her with calm gravity. I'm not throwing you anywhere, Miss Hartwell. You're responsible for where your choices lead you. She began to protest, the words spilling out fast, almost desperate. I'm a corporate executive. I've never been in trouble. This is ridiculous. I pay taxes that fund this courtroom. You can't just... that was enough. I raised a hand. And Miss Hartwell, I said quietly, you may hold an executive title, but in this courtroom you are no different from the young man who sweeps the streets or the mother who struggles to pay her fines. Pay her fines. The law doesn't bend to wealth, and it doesn't bow to status. Not here. Her voice cracked slightly now, the earlier confidence replaced with disbelief. Your Honor, please. It was just a moment of frustration. I didn't mean anything by it. I leaned forward, softening my tone slightly, not out of sympathy, but out of principle. Frustration is human. We all feel it. But character is measured by how we act when we're frustrated. You had a choice, to speak respectfully or to lash out. You chose the latter, and choices have consequences. I looked toward the bailiff again. Miss Hartwell is held in contempt of court, I declared. She is to be remanded into custody immediately. The sound of the gavel striking would echoed sharply, a sound that always carries finality. The bailiff approached her gently but firmly. She backed away instinctively, shaking her head. I know, you can't do this, she whispered, but I could. I had to, because if I allowed that kind of disrespect to go unpunished, I'd be teaching everyone in that room, and everyone watching, that arrogance wins, that justice can be mocked without consequence. As she was escorted out, I saw something flicker across her face. Fear, maybe, or the realization that power and position meant nothing here. And as the door closed behind her, I sat back in my chair for a moment, the silence still hanging in the air. I didn't feel anger. I felt something closer to sadness, not for myself, but for her. Because sometimes people climb so high in their own pride that they forget how far the fall can be. That morning, the courtroom learned that respect isn't demanded, it's demonstrated, and when it's absent, justice must defend itself. The courtroom door shut with a soft final click, and for a few long seconds, no one dared to move. The echo of the gavel still hung in the air, sharp, deliberate, and unforgettable. You could almost feel everyone in that room processing what they just witnessed. The woman who had strutted in like she owned the place, confident, composed, and perfectly polished, had just been let out in handcuffs, not because of her speeding ticket, not because of her wealth or her arrogance, but because of a single moment, a single thoughtless gesture born of ego and entitlement. That's the thing about contempt. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It grows quietly, fed by pride, watered by privilege, and left unchecked until it demands to be seen. Jennifer Hartwell had built her career on control. Control over her image, control over her words, control over her surroundings. But inside a courtroom, control belongs to the law. And the moment she forgot that, the moment she mistook the judge's patience for weakness, everything she had built began to unravel. Your Honor, the prosecutor finally said, breaking the silence. His tone was respectful, almost cautious. And for the record, the defendant's gesture was witnessed by myself, the court staff, and several dozen citizens present in the gallery. I nodded slowly. I noted, Counselor. I glanced around the room. Every eye was on me. Not with judgment, but with a kind of reverent stillness. They knew something important had just happened, something symbolic. I turned my gaze back to the empty podium where she'd stood. We'll let the record show. I said, that Miss Hartwell is being held in contempt of court, pending further review. The court reporter's fingers began clicking again, capturing every word. The courtroom, once tense with confrontation, now felt heavy with reflection. People were thinking about their own lives, their own tempers, their own moments of pride that had almost gone too far. Because here's the truth. Disrespect doesn't just hurt the person you aim it at. It diminishes you. When the bailiff returned a few minutes later, he nodded subtly to indicate that Miss Hartwell had been taken into custody without further incident. I exhaled, then leaned back slightly in my chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my tone calm but deliberate. What you witnessed here today is not something I take lightly. Holding someone in contempt of court is one of the most serious actions a judge can take. It is never my goal to humiliate anyone or to use this bench as a weapon. But there are moments like this, where silence, leniency, or tolerance would do more harm than good. The gallery listened intently. You could have heard a pin drop. This courtroom, I continued, is not a stage for arrogance or anger. It's a place where the rule of law stands above emotion, above ego, above all of us. When someone mocks that, when they turn that sacred space into a spectacle, they don't just disrespect me. They disrespect every person who believes in justice. An elderly man in the back row nodded slowly, his veteran's cap tilted forward. A young woman sitting near the front clasped her hands together, her eyes wide with the weight of what she'd seen. Some people, I went on, believe that respect must be earned. And in life, that's often true. But there are certain institutions, certain moments where respect is not optional. No. You don't earn the right to speak to a judge with civility. You show it automatically because you're in the presence of the law. Not the person, but the principle. That was the heart of it. Jennifer Hartwell hadn't insulted me personally. If it had been just me, maybe I could have brushed it off. But I wasn't just me in that moment. I was the robe, the gavel, the institution, a representative of something much larger, something that demands dignity. And that's what people often misunderstand about courtroom decorum. It's not about inflating a judge's ego. It's about maintaining order in a space where truth and justice are meant to prevail. When respect disappears, chaos follows. As the courtroom began to process my words, I looked down at the docket, my hand resting lightly on the bench. But my mind was still with her, the woman in the designer suit, the executive who had mistaken power for immunity. Somewhere, just down the hall, she was sitting in a holding room. The shock was probably wearing off by now. The adrenaline would be fading, replaced by something heavier, realization. And I hoped deeply that realization would become understanding. Because in the quiet of a holding cell, when the world stops catering to you, you begin to see yourself more clearly. There's no boardroom table to hide behind. No assistant to handle the fall. Just you, your thoughts, and the echo of your own choices. That's where real change begins, in the silence after the storm. I took a moment to look around the courtroom once more. Some people looked shaken, others looked inspired. That's what justice does sometimes. It teaches two lessons at once. It humbles the proud and reminds the humble that fairness still exists. I turned to the clerk. We'll reconvene this matter in 72 hours, I said. Miss Hartwell will have an opportunity to demonstrate understanding and remorse. Until then, she remains in custody. The clerk nodded. The bailiff called the next case, and life in the courtroom moved on, as it always does. But even as the next defendant stepped forward, everyone in that room knew they'd just witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Because that's what happens when the law defends its own dignity. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about preservation, preserving the respect that gives a system its strength, the decency that gives it heart, and the humility that reminds us we're all equal before the law. Jennifer Hartwell's contempt charge wasn't just a legal consequence, it was a human one. In that single moment, a raised hand, a foolish gesture, she learned a truth that no Ivy League degree or executive salary could ever teach. Respect isn't a sign of weakness. It's the foundation of civilization. The courtroom didn't return to normal immediately. Even as the next case was called, the air felt heavier, thick with thought. You could sense that everyone was still processing what had happened with Jennifer Hartwell. They stay with you. They make people think about their own sense of respect, about where lines should be drawn, and about what happens when those lines are crossed. When I finally called for a brief recess, the murmurs began. People turned to one another, not in gossip, but in quiet disbelief. You could hear words like unbelievable, crazy, and she actually did that? Echo softly around the room. It was an outrage that filled the space. It was reflection, a kind of collective awakening to how fragile respect can be and how quickly it can disappear. I've spent more than 3 decades on the bench, and I've seen just about every kind of person walk through those doors, from struggling single parents to powerful professionals. Some come scared, some come angry, some come humbled. But that morning reminded me that entitlement has no boundaries. It wears expensive suits just as easily as it wears street clothes. When I returned to the bench, the courtroom fell silent again. Everyone seemed to be waiting for me to say something more about what they'd just seen. And I knew I needed to. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that every dramatic moment in court is also a chance to teach something that goes beyond the law itself. I cleared my throat and looked toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I began slowly. What happened here today is not something I take any pride in. No judge does. Holding someone in contempt is a last resort, a tool of necessity, not of power. But it's also a reminder that this courtroom isn't just four walls and a gavel. It represents something sacred. The word sacred lingered in the air. It wasn't one I used lightly. This place, I continued, exists to uphold the rule of law, the very thing that allows society to function. It's where disputes are settled not with fists or threats, but with fairness, evidence, and truth. And for that process to work, there must be respect, not for me personally, but for what this bench stands for. From the back of the room, an elderly man raised his hand. His face was lined with the kind of dignity that only comes from years of living with purpose. I recognized him, Robert Chen, a retired Korean War veteran who'd appeared in my court before for a minor parking issue. Your Honor, he said softly, may I speak? I nodded. Of course, Mr. Chen. Please. He stood slowly steadying himself on the pew before speaking. When I was young, he began, his voice calm but strong. When we were taught that there are certain things in life you show respect for automatically. The flag, the church, the family dinner table, and the courtroom. Those weren't places where you tested your attitude. They were places where you showed gratitude for living in a country that values order and fairness. That woman today, she forgot that. Maybe nobody ever taught her. The courtroom was utterly still. Every word he spoke carried the weight of experience. I felt a swell of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude for his wisdom, sadness for the truth in what he'd said. Thank you, Mr. Chen, I told him. You're absolutely right. Respect for institutions isn't outdated. It's essential. It's what separates order from chaos. When we stop showing respect for the spaces that protect justice, we start losing the very justice we rely on. I'm a high school teacher, she explained, and I see that kind of attitude every day. Kids who think rules are for other people, who believe that their parents' money or influence will always protect them. But watching what happened here today, she paused, her voice trembling slightly. It gave me hope. Hope that maybe there are still consequences in this world. That respect still matters. Her words struck deeply. I looked around at the faces in the gallery. Working people, retirees, students, parents, and I could see they were all thinking the same thing. How did we reach a point where respect became negotiable? When did basic decency start feeling optional? Thank you for sharing that, I said to her. And you're right. Respect isn't old-fashioned. It's foundational. It's what makes us human. And while laws are written on paper, the spirit that enforces them, the respect we bring into this room, that comes from the heart. I took a moment, letting my words settle. You see, I continued, and Ms. Hartwell believed her money, her position, her intelligence somehow exempted her from humility. She thought fairness was something you purchased, not something you practiced. But today, she learned that equality before the law is not a slogan, it's a reality. In this courtroom, a millionaire stands in the same place as a minimum wage worker. The same laws apply. The same respect is required. That's not oppression. That's fairness. There were nods throughout the room. Even the bailiff, a man who'd seen countless outbursts over the years, looked, moved. That's the beauty of the system, I said. When it works properly, it reminds us that no one, not even a judge, stands above it. The law binds us all equally, and respect is the thread that keeps it all together. As I spoke those words, I wasn't thinking about punishment anymore. I was thinking about prevention, about teaching every person who watched that scene unfold that respect for the courtroom isn't a sign of weakness or submission. No, it's a sign of understanding. It's the acknowledgement that justice is fragile, and we each have a duty to protect it. When I finally brought the gavel down again to resume the next case, the sound wasn't just procedural, it was symbolic. A reminder that this courtroom wasn't just a place where fines were paid or sentences were given. It was a place where lessons about character, humility, and respect were written into the fabric of justice itself. That day, everyone walked out with more than they expected. Some came for a ticket, others for a hearing, but all of them left with a lesson. Power may buy comfort, but it can't buy respect. And in the eyes of justice, respect will always be the great equalizer. When the gavel fell for the final time that morning, the sound lingered longer than usual. It wasn't just the end of a case. It was the closing of a moment that everyone in that courtroom would remember for years. You could feel it in the silence that followed. The kind of silence that carries thought, reflection, and a deep understanding that something more than a fine or sentence had just taken place. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks in quiet firmness, in a voice that reminds us not just what the law is, but why it exists. That day, justice had to defend itself. Not against violence or corruption, but against arrogance, against the slow erosion of respect that begins when people stop seeing institutions as sacred. Jennifer Hartwell walked into my courtroom, a woman of influence, a corporate executive. Polished, confident, powerful, she believed she understood how the world worked, that status could bend rules, and that the law was just another obstacle to be managed. But what she didn't understand was that in this room, titles mean nothing. The courtroom is the great equalizer. It strips away the illusions of hierarchy and forces everyone to stand on the same ground, the truth. As I sat there after her sentencing, I thought about the opportunity she still had. Because despite her arrogance, despite the disrespect, I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted her to learn. That's why I gave her 72 hours. 72 hours to sit in silence, away from the noise of her world, and reflect. To write her statement, not for me, not for the record, but for herself. I've seen many people in that position before. Men and women who thought they were above the law until life humbled them. Some come out bitter, unchanged. Others come out better with a new understanding of what respect really means. I hoped Jennifer would choose the latter. As she was led away in handcuffs, her designer suit now wrinkled and out of place, I saw something in her eyes. The first glimmer of realization. Not just fear, but recognition. For the first time, she seemed to understand that this wasn't about punishment. It was about principle. Later that afternoon, I sat in chambers, looking over the docket for the next day. The courthouse had returned to its usual rhythm. Traffic tickets, municipal violations, the everyday pulse of justice. But my mind kept returning to that moment when she lifted her hand, the defiance in her eyes, the collective gasp from the gallery. It wasn't the gesture itself that disturbed me, it was what it represented. A symptom of something deeper, a culture that has begun to mistake freedom for license and equality for exemption. People often say the law should be compassionate, and I agree. But compassion cannot exist without respect. When someone disrespects the system that protects their own rights, they undermine the very compassion they expect to receive. That's why the contempt ruling wasn't about ego. It was about defending the court, the foundation of fairness itself. Because if one person can mock that foundation without consequence, the cracks begin to spread, and soon everyone believes they can do the same. A few hours later, as I walked through the courthouse hallway, an older woman approached me. She was small, maybe in her 70s, holding her grandson by the hand. Judge Caprio, she said softly, I thank you for what you did today. My grandson was here. He saw it. I wanted him to see what happens when someone forgets what respect means. Her words stayed with me, because that's exactly what the courtroom should do. It should teach. Every ruling, every fine, every sentence should carry a lesson, not of fear, but of understanding. The next morning, I thought again about Jennifer Hartwell. I pictured her sitting alone in a small cell, her thoughts likely racing. Maybe for the first time in years, she was experiencing a silence she couldn't control, a moment where there was no phone to answer, no email to send, no assistant to call. Just her, the four walls, and the truth she had been avoiding. And I hoped, sincerely, that she was beginning to see that humility doesn't make you small. It makes you human. 3 days later, she would return to my courtroom to read her statement. Whether her words would show remorse or just fear of consequence, I didn't know yet. But what I did know was this. The courtroom had done what it was meant to do. It had reminded everyone, her, the audience, and even those watching at home, that the rule of law isn't a suggestion. It's a covenant. A promise we make to one another that we will live in a world governed by fairness, not ego. When I finally addressed the court again, I looked out at the faces before me and said, "This courtroom doesn't exist to humiliate anyone. It exists to teach that respect is not conditional. It's not something you give only when you agree with the outcome. It's something you give because you understand what's at stake when it disappears." That's the part people forget. The law isn't some cold, faceless machine. It's a living system built on human belief. Belief in fairness, belief in order, belief that justice means something. When that belief erodes, justice collapses. So yes, Jennifer Hartwell's case was about a speeding ticket. But it became something far greater, a lesson for everyone who's ever walked into a courtroom thinking it was just another inconvenience. It became a reminder that justice must defend itself from disrespect, just as it defends the innocent from the guilty. That day, I didn't just uphold the law. I upheld the dignity of the law. Because when respect dies, so does justice. And as long as I wear this robe, I will never let that happen.